You're listening to Humans in Tech. Our podcast explores today's most transformative technology and the trends of tomorrow, bringing together the brightest minds in and outside of our industry. We unpack what's new in physical access, identity verification, cybersecurity, and IoT ecosystems. We reach beyond the physical world, discuss our digital transformation as a species, and dive into the emerging phygital experience. Join us on our journey as we discover just how connected the future will be and how we will fit into that picture. Your host is Lee Dow, VP of Global Marketing at Identiv.
Thank you for tuning in. Today we're joined by Dr. Richard Kuntz, newly appointed member of the Identiv Board of Directors. Rick brings a significant amount of IoT digital transformation vision and growth strategy expertise to Identiv's board with his outstanding leadership in the medical industry. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Lee.
First, I'd like to mention that you have such an impressive resume. Perhaps start with just telling us a little bit about your background, your area of expertise within the industry.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a cardiologist, and I did my training in cardiology in Boston at the Harvard hospitals. That's a long program because I also involved a subspecialty of interventional cardiology. So that was my clinical training. And then during my fellowship at Harvard, I was interested in clinical research, more specifically into statistics. So I got a degree in biostatistics at the Harvard School of Public Health, a master's degree. And at the time that I had finished my fellowship and started on faculty, initially at the Beth Israel Hospital, then over at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, the interventional cardiology programs were taking off, and the FDA was increasing the requirements for approval. So medical devices like those using cardiology could easily be approved by a small single-arm registry. And around 1991, 92, the FDA required those devices to actually stand up to a randomized controlled clinical trial. So being a freshly admitted statistician and cardiologist, I was called on by a lot of companies to help design their studies.
Oh, I bet.
And, so I started a academic CRO called the Harvard Clinical Research Institute. And we basically, I think when I left Harvard in 2005, we had 300 employees. And we ran probably 70 or 80% of the medical device studies in the country over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s. So my background is mainly in practicing in clinical cardiology, interventional cardiology, but also in clinical trial methodology.
So that's just such an interesting combination, having that medical background and then also wanting to, get more expertise in statistics. And so how did that transition into your work with Medtronic?
Yes. So part of exposure to medical trial methodology is to demonstrate that you really have to have rigorous studies to demonstrate evidence. That you can easily be fooled by studies that don't randomize or studies that don't use sham procedures or blinding. So a lot of my interest was really in making sure that that when there was a conclusion, the evidence was solid, and that's required for any kind of medical therapy. When I was doing studies for Medtronic at Harvard, the senior leadership there asked me if I'd be interested in joining the company. And interestingly enough, my first role was to run a business. And the first business I ran was the neuromodulation business, which is not cardiology, it's neurology.
Right.
And that was a big business. It was about 1 to 1.5 billion in revenue. And we had 4,500 employees in that business unit. And they took a relatively big risk because I did not have an MBA. I had very minimal business background running the CRO. And essentially, I came on as the president and CEO of the neuromodulation business, Medtronic. And I did that for about 5 years, and it was fun. Learned a lot about devices like deep brain stimulators or spinal cord stimulators, different brain targets. It was just fascinating. And then around 2011, I moved to 2010 and 11. I moved to a more central role, which is probably better for my skill set, and that was the chief medical and scientific officer for the company overall.
I was telling our other new board member, Laura Angelini, that who also has a medical device background, that so many in my family work in the medical industry. I'm sort of like the odd duck who they're like, oh, she does something in technology. But my sister's a neurologist, and it's just talking with her, and she started off in research and then moved into medical practice, and just always fascinating, the workings of the brain and the body. Very interesting topic. So I can even though I'm not not in the medical community, it's still super interesting to me, and I can geek out on that all day long.
Well, the neuromodulation space in particular, and that includes things like Parkinson's disease, even emotional problems like depression or anxiety, they are now and probably will be extended to be solved by medical devices, which is kind of surprising to most people. But mainly it's through controlled electrical stimulation of different targets of the brain. And it's a very complicated, very sophisticated field. It's very exciting, and it's really growing. So the medical devices in the brain, you wouldn't think that that's going to be the solution, but it's been very successful. And I think the future is going to be even more impressive.
I completely agree. When I worked at Honeywell, there's a whole facility that Honeywell operates on behalf of the federal government. So it's Honeywell employees, and the whole facility is filled with Honeywell people, but it actually belongs to the federal government. And while they focus on very specific federal projects, when they do have extra capacity and they get permission, the federal government allows them to use part of that facility specializes in miniaturization. And so they have worked on quite a few, brain devices to miniaturize a technology so that it can be implanted or used in the body. So again, I just love stuff like that. It's so interesting to me. Can you give us
a large engineering thrust of medical device companies is miniaturization?
Oh, is it really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So if you look at the history of a pacemaker, which started out about the size of a softball, and now they're so small, complete dual chamber pacemaker can be inserted with a catheter, and the pacemaker itself is the size of a vitamin pill. It's just injected right into the right ventricle.
Oh wow!
So when you think about what that is, that means that they've been able to take the radio, the battery, the electronics and programming and software, and take it from the size of a softball down to the size of a vitamin pill, with even more features. So miniaturization, especially in electrical circuitry and CMOS chips and everything like that, is a large part of medical devices.
Which has to be such a much better outcome for the patient, I would assume.
Yeah, anytime you do an invasive procedure on a patient, if you can minimize the invasion, the incision you make, the way that you get there in a lot of cardiology, most of the highways to get into the heart are through the veins and arteries. So you just make a tiny little stick in the leg, and you can pretty much get anywhere in the body.
That's so cool.
And so, but it also requires you to have small enough devices that fit in those arteries and veins to be delivered. So there's I would say that if you're looking at the big trends in engineering, it is really trying to make things small. And as you make things smaller, you make them faster too, because the circuitry doesn't have to go as far. So this is something that's continuing to explode. And then what's even more interesting is that I also serve on a board called Rockley Photonics, which is a silicon photonics company in Pasadena. And they have chips that not only use copper traces for electrons, but fiber optic traces for photons. And these are much more efficient chips. So there's just a variety of new ways that engineering and medical devices is going to continue to evolve.
Well, I did many, many, many months ago, because I've been at Identiv now just about 2 years, and learning more and more about the different market segments. And I did a lot of research on just the IoT in general and the technology stack of the IoT, and really figuring out where do we fit in that stack, and where are we differentiated. And really Identiv's RFID enabled IoT solutions are integrated now into about 1.5 billion physical things, and create that digital identity for every physical object, and then deliver that digital transformation across just such a wide variety of industries. And when you look at that, so where do we fit in that stack? And there's a lot of there's not a lot of agreement from an engineering standpoint on even what is the IoT stack, how many layers are there, but the sounding layer, the perception layer, the data transfer layer is really where we live. And that's really where we are, experts in putting data in motion and making those connections. So, can you give us some personal insight into the rise in demand for more connected and sophisticated healthcare systems within that IoT stack?
Yeah, well, just from a 30,000 foot level, there are all kinds of very strong secular trends happening in medicine. The biggest trend I would summarize by saying moving from episodic care to continuous care. So the kind of bedrock of medicine is to, with a chronic disease like diabetes or heart failure, is to see a provider once every 3 months or so. In that 10 or 15-minute encounter, that physician tries to predict what will happen in the next 3 months and may adjust the medications, and then the patient's on their own. And their next interaction might be a problem associated with that chronic disease, an episode that results in them going to the emergency room, maybe an ICU. And that's just not a very efficient way of taking care of patients, right? Is to kind of push them out the door, say, hopefully you're going to do all right for the next 3 months, and I'll see you for my next visit. So that's the classic episodic care. It's not very efficient. Patients get in the hospital for 3 or 4 days or longer if they have exacerbation of their disease. A better way to do it is to have a much more continuous monitoring of their disease on a regular basis that can be interacted with either providers or extended providers or AI ML systems. And that trend is exploding right now. And part of that trend is the advent of a variety of really interesting sensing devices that have been developed in the last few years and are continuously being developed. And then the second thing is going to be the connectivity, as you mentioned, between this data, leveraging a variety of different data highways into the cloud. That includes everything from the local radios to an iPhone, faster wireless systems like 5G, and then, of course, machine learning and AI of that data in the cloud. So that's exploding, but it's going to cause a massive transformation in medicine. And so where Identiv can fit into that secular trend, which is going to be positive for Identiv, is going to be super exciting because that kind of horse has left the barn already.
Right. So the medical and pharmaceutical industry is recognized as, like you said, one of the largest global marketing opportunities and go-to-market opportunities for Identiv IoT products and services. So with your experience in managing disciplined global operations for very large multinational healthcare organizations and integrating leading-edge tech into process, how do you envision our growth plans in this important market?
Well, the first is going to be to identify specific use conditions that will be improved for that. And in medicine, that's not that hard to do. You basically pick a disease or a specific aspect of the disease where you can identify a problem. Diabetics who get poorly controlled and have episodes of diabetic ketoacidosis, and can be almost fatal. How can we make that better? And that might be that we look at the entire episode and understand where can data flow and how can we basically add Identiv's specific value to that chain. So almost all of it starts with identifying clear-cut problems in the existing system, understanding the use cases for those problems, and then getting your engineers and creative people to say, we can improve that use condition easily by adding this value to say the wireless stream or the way the data is handled.
Well, I thought your comment earlier about how managing, seeing a patient for maybe 15 or 20 minutes at best every 3 months, and then they have, some sort of episode rather than a continuous monitoring of their condition. I would think that in your line of work, in cardiology, there's probably a lot of events that maybe they don't even know they're having.
Right. Well, in the classic example of that is atrial fibrillation, which is now becoming much more curable than it was in the past. But the first thing that has to happen, because of the advances in mapping technology and ablation that are pretty common now, part of it is understanding whether you have the problem or not. So, there have been a variety of implantable sensors that have radios that can communicate this store data to the cloud, and then that can be available for providers to use. And at Medtronic, we have a very large system like that we manage, and then we distribute that information to physicians, and they can see in real time what's happening to their patients and get summary data as well.
Does it allow for predictable insights?
It does, and a lot of the even implantable devices are leveraging using the familiar term called edge computing, which is where ML is done in the box itself, rather than having to go to cloud for analysis. And so many of our pacemakers, for example, that also detect terrible rhythms like atrial fibrillation, or even worse, ventricular fibrillation, which can kill you. They can customize to the patient how to, say, do something called overdrive pacing when this device sees a set of rhythms that has been trained in that patient to be associated with a bad outcome.
Oh, and so specific and unique to that patient.
Yes, specifically, yes. Well, there's two things. There's going to be the cluster of all patients to give you great insight because of the sample size, and it can fine-tune that further with the patient itself by using edge computing in the device within the patient. So that's happening already, and a variety of changeable algorithms are occurring, and that's happening in not only cardiology, it's happening clearly with our diabetes, where we have a closed loops systems for continuous glucose monitoring and administration of insulin to keep someone exactly in the 80 to 120 zone. And then we do also that in deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. We have closed loop systems that monitor brain signals and alter the output based on outcomes that it can measure, and trains it specifically for that patient.
So how do you stay super hyper connected to, I mean, the thing we talk about medical devices, right? And MedTech as if it's like this really, finite little ecosystem. But the truth is that within that, there's so many specializations and, subcategories of topics. How do you stay on top of what the latest and greatest is in trends and MedTech?
Well, it all depends what the role is. In my role as chief medical and scientific officer, I'm responsible for making sure that I'm on top of disease conditions that might be that benefited from this. And we have a lot of people who do that, but specifically with the physician input as opposed to an engineering input. And it's easy because if you're curious, it's fun.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. And so, I'm fascinated by physiology and pathophysiology. And so are all my colleagues that I worked with when I was at Medtronic. So, they're constantly interfacing with their physician customers. They attend many of the scientific meetings where they're brought up. Medtronic is also heavily involved in the publication side of things. We work with doctors on publications, and we actually have our own publications and or support, independent publications. A lot of the devices we want to have completely independent, so we want them to write the papers, not us. But at the same time, we support them on those issues too. So, staying abreast of the literature, staying abreast of current, water cooler talk with physicians, what's bugging them the most right now, is really the critical inputs that you have to have that gives you the ideas. And then, of course, to have the interface with electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. That can solve is ultimately the problem. I mean, the common model of medical device in how someone solves something, which is more mythical maybe than real, but was at one point an important thing, is that a physician comes to an engineer with a problem, and then the engineer solves it. And in the case of Medtronic, that's how the company started in the 1950s. In Minnesota, there was a famous heart surgeon, Walter Lillehei, who did world-class pediatric heart surgery, and people from all over the world would fly into Minneapolis, to have this surgeon operate on them. When these kids got operated on, they had to put in temporary pacemakers because the impact of the surgery on the heart stunned their pacemaker system, so they had to be electrically stimulated for a couple of days. Back in the 50s and late 40s, all the pacemakers were these big vacuum tube boxes that got plugged into the wall.
Oh, wow.
They're taking AC and transferring it to DC energy. And literally, there's pictures of them. They're like the size of huge carts that they wheel around, these little kids. One one evening in December, there was a storm and the electrical support or power was off for a couple hours, and a baby died who was dependent on an AC powered pacemaker. And so Walter Lillehei talked to the founder of our company, a guy named Earl Bakken, who at that time was an electrical engineer repair person in the hospital and took care of those vacuum tube systems, and asked him, this is never going to happen again. I need to have a battery powered pacemaker. And the story from this it is mythical, but the story is that Earl went to his last copy of Popular Electronics, went to the back pages and bought a circuit diagram for a metronome.
Like a piano metronome.
Yeah, and at that time, Motorola just came out with the first transistors, and so it was a transistor-based one. This was like the 1951 or 52 or something like that. And he basically developed this metronome in a box he built himself with wires that came out that could be used for pacing. And he, worked with them to find out the right power requirements. And that was used immediately after for a couple of years, and every one of those patients got operated on. And that's how the company started. And
I didn't know that. That's such an interesting story.
So it is a great story, but it goes with one of the roles of how you solve a problem is you have to have the unmet need identified. And that's going to be best done by the clinician in medicine who sees this, who every day sees a problem in their practice, or they get the best insight because they deal with it every day. And then to be able to translate into a problem that can be understood by an engineer, who then can try to solve the problem. And that's whether that's in spine, work where you're looking at, pedicle screws and rods, or very delicate electrical work like deep brain stimulators. That's the common pattern of identification of a problem and invention and solution.
Well, I would think it's such an amazing field to work in if you like to solve puzzles and problems.
It is. And I think we have, last count, we have 120. Medtronic had 105 to 110,000 employees, and I think about 30,000 were engineers.
Oh wow! Wow, that's huge.
And they're all pretty smart.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah. So they're used to understanding where to take the ball when a problem has been identified, and to work back with the physicians and with their prototypes and everything else. And it's exciting.
Yeah. Well, you've had just such an amazing career. What do you see in the future overall for MedTech transforming healthcare?
I think it's going to be a large movement in sensors. I think that's something that's going to explode in MedTech to some degree. And I'm seeing explosions right now in things like there are companies now making watches that look like they can measure blood pressure, look like they can measure glucose without using a needle, can measure a variety of different parameters that we never thought you could measure before. And these are going to be wristwatches. And so these kind of, again, going to continuous medicine is going to be a way that we can start to look at how do we solve a problem that needs continuous input. And that's going to be a big part of MedTech. So I don't think it's going to be a matter of saying, here's a $5,000 pacemaker, just buy it and good luck. It's going to be, we're going to sell you a pacemaker and we're going to guarantee you that this patient's going to be fine for the next 5 years. And we're going to sell you the entire system, including the sensor, the measurement, the connection with your provider as a package, because we're more interested in the outcome for the patient than selling you just a box. And I think that's going to be a big trend in medicine. I think the other big trend in medical devices is going to be management of the data. And what I mean by that is using the word data provenance. And what that is the sticky rules and rights and consents required to be able to share data. It's very complicated. It hasn't been worked out yet. But as we see better computing power and more applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's going to require a lot of data from patients. And we're still working out, privacy issues and the rights and stuff like that. And it's a relatively hairy problem, but it will be solved. But it's just another trend that we have to pay attention to.
Well, it's not only a hairy problem, but I don't know if you knew this about me, but I started my career in the U.S. Senate. And, so I've written and drafted, legislation, and, I've watched people give testimony, and I sort of I'm at the point where I just want to throw things at the TV when I watch people try to, when I watch like our governing bodies try to legislate some of these things and listen to expert testimony, because no one can be an expert at everything, and you have to make very significant decisions from a legislative standpoint when you're in those roles. And so not only is it, there's a lot of complexity, but there's also just a level of understanding that really isn't there.
Right.
And not just in federal government, right, but also in state and local. We also see that with some of the physical access control products that are coming out, with facial recognition and biometrics and that sort of thing, that there's just not enough deep subject matter expertise guiding those decisions today. So that continues to make it a challenge as well, right?
It is, and I think that's going to. It's the two issues about the data sharing component is that data sharing is going to be required for us to be able to get the amount of data where we can apply learning, machine learning and AI, and that's going to be good. But it also is going to require us to understand, who is going to be managing that data, who's curating that data, is it going to be safe? And this is something that's just not well worked out. The other is, what level of consent do you need from patient to leverage their data? When you go to 23andMe to turn in your data, they can sell that data later.
Right.
People are finding out, well, this company just made money on my DNA.
Right.
Why am I not being monetized on that? So these are sticky issues. It's an extension of the HIPAA issue, about sharing data, but I think that's going to be very active going forward because of the massive ease of use of wide and large amounts of data. We're seeing that already in the liquid biopsy business. These are the companies that are looking for early signs of cancer in your blood. And these companies are really taking off. But the key is they're getting your entire DNA system, set up when you're turning your blood in. And the question is, well, if that company's monetizing an ability to predict cancer and they're using my DNA, shouldn't I get money for that? And that's a big discussion that's going on right now. So I think the data provenance issues are going to be just as complex, but also it will move forward as the technology on data handling.
The thing that I picked up from quite a few of your examples is really being able to better focus on delivering positive outcomes for patients.
Correct. That's a great way to put it. It's you're not saying here's a disease, you need this box put into you. It's here's a disease, we're going to give you this outcome which is good for you, and that's widening the responsibility and accountability of the company, and that. There are many terms for that. One term is called value-based healthcare, where you look at the patient and understand the patient is the one with the disease. The patient is the one you're focused on. You need to make that patient better, not just sell them a device and then wipe your hands. It's you're selling them a solution. And so the focus on outcomes. It's always been difficult in the past because medical records were always so difficult to work with. They weren't intended to be aggregated. Very difficult to follow patients, because you don't know if they go to a big tertiary hospital, we don't know where they're going to next. So measuring outcomes, unless you had a structured clinical trial, which are very expensive, you really can't measure outcomes. But now with a much better ease of use of data and data flows and systems like 5G and radio systems, we can start to get a variety of follow-up through the internet. And if you look at companies like Verily, which is one of the Google companies, their whole focus is understanding how to leverage the internet to follow patients and follow people longitudinally. So I just think there's going to be a lot more tools to be able to make some very interesting applications. I think Identiv is going to be right in the center of this because if you look at, like you said, the movement of data, and also of potential devices and drugs, there's going to be a lot better highways to attach that information on once we get through some of the technicalities, but also some of the policy issues like the provenance.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're one of our newest board members, but I found this conversation really fascinating, discussing, just the transformational power of technology on the healthcare industry. And I think you brought up some really important topics and points that we're probably going to want to explore in additional future podcasts.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lee. It was really fun.
Of course. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for me. We drop a new episode every Thursday.
Meet UHF RFID TOM labels. Our thin RFID on-metal portfolio is a flexible way to tag and track metallic items with the highest ultra-high frequency performance. Tag any type of metal item in industrial applications, container tracking, metal-based commodities and goods, bike tagging, and practically any application in the automotive industry. Learn more at Identiv.com. Smart, simple, single-use technology can put valuable time back in the hands of healthcare workers and around the world. Identiv's capacitive fill-level sensing tags are the first passive NFC-enabled sensing solution to monitor fill levels. Simply attach the tag to any cartridge, bottle, or liquid-filled container to sense the fill level. No external sensors or special equipment required. The tags can also sense if syringes or auto-injectors have been properly administered, empowering clinical trials, patient compliance, and telemedicine applications. Learn more at Identiv.com. Physical security, identity verification, the IoT. The hyperconnectivity of our lives will only grow more pervasive. As technology becomes more automated and experiences more augmented, it's up to us to preserve our humanity and use new tools and trends for good. The only question is, are we up for the challenge?